A flash in the darkness. The echo of his steps resonated through the empty streets of the city. Matías walked aimlessly, feeling his life crumbling with every breath. He had lost his job, his wife had left him, and debt was sinking him into an endless pit. He wondered if God still heard him, if he even cared. That night, a storm threatened to break out. The clouds hid the moon, and the cold wind cut through his skin. He stopped in front of an old stone church, its doors wide open. The dim light of the candles illuminated the interior with a warm glow, contrasting with the darkness of his soul. With a sigh, Matías crossed the threshold. He couldn't remember the last time he had prayed, but his knees gave way at the foot of the altar. Lord, if you're there, tell me there's still hope for me. A thunderclap rumbled in the sky, and in that moment, a deep and serene voice whispered inside him, Matías, I have always been here. His skin tingled, and his heart raced. He turned around, searching for the source of the voice, but he was alone. However, something inside him had changed. The air inside the church seemed thicker, more real. Matías felt something invisible enveloping him, a presence he couldn't explain but that filled his chest with an unfamiliar warmth. His shaky breath faltered as he looked at the altar, waiting for a sign, a confirmation that the voice hadn't just been his imagination. Then, the flame of one of the candles flickered strongly, as if an invisible wind had touched it. Matías swallowed, feeling a mix of fear and awe. God, is that you? He whispered with a broken voice. Silence answered at first, but then a thought formed clearly in his mind, as if someone were speaking directly to his soul. Do not fear, child. I've been waiting for this moment. Tears began to flow uncontrollably. He had spent so long feeling alone, thinking God had abandoned him, that now, feeling his presence, his heart shattered. He covered his face with his hands, sobbing. He didn't understand what was happening, but for the first time in a long while, he felt that he wasn't completely lost. Just then, an older man appeared from the back of the church. His clothes were simple and his gait was slow. He approached with a kind smile and placed a hand on Matías's shoulder. Child, God has never left. Maybe it's time for you to hear what he has to say. Matías looked up, surprised by the certainty in the elderly man's words. Matías eyed the old man warily. How did he know what he was feeling? How could he speak with such certainty about God? Who are you? He asked, his voice trembling. The old man smiled gently and sat down on the pew next to him. I'm just a servant of the Lord. I've seen many enter here looking for answers, but few are truly willing to listen. Are you ready? Matías lowered his gaze. He didn't know if he was ready. For years, he had tried to control his life, making decisions that led to failure. Now, he found himself at his lowest point with nothing left to lose. I don't know what to do, he whispered. I've tried everything and I keep falling further. The old man nodded slowly, as if he understood every word. Sometimes, child, God lets us reach the bottom so that we learn to look to him alone. It's not a punishment. It's an invitation. Matías furrowed his brow. An invitation? To what? The old man leaned slightly toward him, his gaze filled with compassion. To stop fighting alone. To surrender into his hands and allow him to do his work in you. Matías felt a lump form in his throat. He had spent so long trying to control his fate that he had never considered surrendering to God. How do I know he still wants me? He asked, his voice breaking. The old man took his hand firmly. Because you're still breathing. The words hit him hard. For the first time in a long while, he felt a ray of hope break through in his heart. Matías shivered. Because I'm still breathing, he repeated in his mind. It was so simple, and yet, those words sparked something inside him, like a spark in the darkness. What if it's too late? He murmured, his voice barely a whisper. The old man shook his head. God doesn't measure time like we do. It doesn't matter how many times you've gone astray or how many times you've fallen. He just waits for you to return to him with a sincere heart. Matías pressed his lips together. Was it really possible? Could God still love him after all his failures? What should I do? He asked, hope timidly creeping into his voice. The old man smiled and pointed to the altar. Talk to him, but not with empty words. Open your heart to him as you would to a father who loves you. Matías felt his legs tremble as he stood. He walked slowly toward the altar, his heart pounding. He knelt, closed his eyes, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't ask for material things or quick solutions. Lord, I'm tired. I've tried to do everything on my own, and I've only failed. If you really are still here, if you still love me, guide me because I don't know how to go on. A deep silence filled the church, but Matías felt something different inside him. It was as if a weight was being lifted from his shoulders. An inexplicable peace began to envelop him. Then, deep within his soul, a voice resonated once more. I've always been with you, child. You just needed to seek me with all your heart. Tears fell freely from his face. For the first time in his life, Matías felt the true presence of God. Matías remained kneeling, his face covered in tears, while the peace he felt continued to grow inside him. He couldn't explain it in words, but it was as if a veil had fallen from his eyes. For years, he had sought answers in the wrong places, trying to fill his emptiness with human solutions, when all he had needed was to surrender to God. The old man watched him from the pew, with a gaze full of understanding. You felt it, didn't you? He asked softly. Matías nodded slowly, still processing what had just happened. I can't explain it, but something inside me changed. The old man smiled. That's God's love. It's not something you can buy or earn with merits. It's a gift. But now comes the real test. Matías frowned and looked at him curiously. What do you mean? The old man calmly intertwined his fingers. You've had an encounter with God, but that doesn't mean life will stop being difficult. Tests will keep coming. Problems won't disappear overnight. But now you won't walk alone. The words hit him hard. Matías had naively thought that maybe this experience would mean the end of his problems. But now he understood that it wasn't about that. So what should I do? He asked, sincere concern in his voice. The old man stood up and placed a hand on his shoulder. Walk with faith. Trust in God with every step, even when you cannot see the path. Matías took a deep breath. For the first time in a long while, he felt no fear. He remained silent, letting the old man's words sink deep into his being. Walk with faith. It was such a simple thing to say, yet so difficult to do. The old man walked toward the church door, pausing for a moment before leaving. God has called you tonight, son, but now it is up to you to answer him every day. With one last smile, he stepped out of the church, leaving Matías alone with his thoughts. Matías looked at the altar once more. The candle that had flickered before now burned steady and bright. Slowly, he stood up and walked out of the temple, his heart lighter than ever. The night was still cold, but the storm seemed to have passed. As he walked through the streets, an idea began to form in his mind. If God was truly with him, then his life had to reflect that change. He could not remain the same. When he arrived at his small apartment, he knelt once again. Lord, I don't know what you want from me, but I am ready to listen. Guide me. That night, he slept deeply, free from the worries that had tormented him for months. And the next morning, something unexpected happened. When Matías woke up, the sun was already beginning to illuminate his modest apartment. At first, The feeling of peace seemed unreachable, like a distant dream. But as he stretched, he realized that it was not just the sunlight brightening his room. Something inside him shone with a renewed light, a clarity he had never experienced before. He got up with a determination he had not felt in a long time. Without thinking twice, he opened the drawer of his desk and took out a blank sheet of paper. He picked up a pen and began to write. The first word was "thank you." It was all he could say. Grateful, even though he did not yet understand everything God was doing in his life. He didn't have answers to all his questions, but he felt certain that he was not alone. Each word he wrote seemed to bring him closer to that deep and liberating truth. After a while, he received an unexpected call. It was from his former boss. "Matías, how have you been?" The voice on the other end was warm, though somewhat surprised. "I'm well. Actually, better than I've been in a long time." "I'm glad to hear that. You see, I've been reviewing some paperwork and noticed that there's an open position in the company. I wanted to know if you'd be interested in coming back. Your old position is available if you'd like it." Matías fell silent. The offer was a miracle, but something in his heart told him he needed to follow a different path. "Thank you for thinking of me, but I need something different. I feel that God has something more for me." There was a pause on the other end of the line, but his boss's voice responded with understanding. "I see. If you ever change your mind, you know where to find me." He hung up the phone, and Matías felt a mix of peace and courage. He didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in his life, he was ready to face the unknown. Matías set the phone down on the table and took a deep breath. Had he just turned down a job when he needed it most? Logic told him he had made a mistake, but his heart was at peace. Something inside him assured him that God had a greater purpose. Without knowing exactly what to do, he decided to go for a walk. His life had changed in a single night, and now he needed to discover what it truly meant to follow God. He walked through the city, observing everything with new eyes. The hustle and bustle of people, the street vendors, the rushing cars. Everything seemed the same, but he no longer was. He passed by a community kitchen and stopped. Through the windows, he could see several homeless people being served by volunteers. Something inside him stirred. He remembered the days when he had felt hunger, loneliness, and despair. How many of these men and women felt the same way he once had? Without thinking twice, he stepped inside. "Good morning," he greeted with a shy smile. A woman with an apron and a kind face approached him. "Good morning. Are you here for a meal?" Matías shook his head. "No, actually, I'd like to help." The woman looked at him curiously, but then smiled warmly. "We always need more hands. Here, take an apron. We're about to start serving lunch." As he put on the apron and moved toward the serving table, Matías felt an indescribable emotion. Maybe this wouldn't bring him money or solve all his problems, but in that moment, he knew with certainty that he was exactly where God wanted him to be. Matías spent the afternoon serving hot meals to those in need. He observed the tired faces, the empty gazes of some, the silent gratitude of others. In every smile he received, in every sincere thank you, he felt that God was speaking to him in a new way. As he cleaned a table, an elderly man with gray hair and worn-out clothes approached cautiously. His eyes reflected a life full of suffering. "Young man, may I ask you something?" he said in a raspy voice. "Of course," Matías replied, stopping to listen. The man lowered his gaze before speaking. "I haven't stepped inside a church in a long time. I lost everything: my family, my home, my dignity. I don't know if God still hears me." Matías felt a lump in his throat. That question was the same one he had asked himself just days ago. He leaned forward and placed a hand on the man's shoulder. "God has never left you. Sometimes we feel alone, but he is always waiting for us to return to him." The man lifted his gaze, his eyes filled with tears. "What if I'm no longer worthy?" Matías smiled gently. "None of us are. But God's love is not about being worthy. It's about accepting his grace." The old man sobbed and slowly nodded. Matías felt warmth in his chest. For the first time, he had not only received God's love, but was also sharing it with another. The elderly man wiped his tears with the back of his hand and, with a shaky sigh, smiled faintly. "I don't know how to thank you, son. I can't remember the last time someone spoke to me about God with such certainty." A shiver ran down Matías' spine. He, who just hours ago had been lost in despair, was now bringing hope to another. "Don't thank me," he said with a sincere smile. "It is God who is calling you, just as he called me." The old man nodded and, after a moment of silence, asked, "Do you think there's still hope for me?" Matías squeezed his shoulder firmly. "There always is." The man let out a sob and, for the first time in years, bowed his head in prayer. Matías joined him, feeling that, in that moment, he was fulfilling the purpose that God had shown him. At the end of his shift, he left the dining hall with his heart overflowing with peace. He had no stable job, no great certainties about the future, but for the first time in his life, he felt no fear. He walked through the city with steady steps, lifting his gaze to the starry sky. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered. "Now I know that I was never alone." And deep in his heart, he felt the same voice from that night in the church, responding to him with love. "You never were, my son.